introducing our speaker today, I want to bring your attention to upcoming events tomorrow. The Wayne Whitmore Center is sponsoring a conference at the law school from 12:30 to 3 called Disasters, Resilience, and the Next Generation. Okay. And are you guys getting a little ring?
Yeah. Try turning it down.
Okay. Let's do that one first. How's this?
Yeah.
Can you still hear me in back? Fine? Good. Okay. And then on February 5th, I want to urge you also to hear Professor Jane Junn from USC, who's doing a talk on a phenomenal new book, Women Voters, Race, Gender, and Dynamism in U.S. Presidential Elections. Some of you may remember she visited us, about 2 years ago and was just extraordinary. We have an amazing speaker today. I'm so glad you're here for her talk. This is Dr. Marisa Abrajano, who is a professor of political science at the University of California, San Diego. Her scholarship, ranging from voting and the mass media to racial and ethnic politics, has appeared in our discipline's very best journals. She's also the author of 3 books, 2 of them award winners. Her most recent book, White Backlash, Immigration, Race, and American Politics, was published by Princeton University and received the American Political Science Association's Ralph Bunche Award for the best book on race and politics in 2015. Professor Abrajano also has been recognized for distinguished teaching at UCSD and recently served as the co-president of the Race, Ethnicity, and Politics section of the American Political Science Association. She has also done public scholarship for the Brookings Institution and the Center for American Progress. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Abrajano.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming today. So today what I'm going to be talking about is a forthcoming book that's coming out this year with Oxford University Press, and the focus, as the title of the book suggests, is about talking about politics, and specifically looking at political discussion networks and its relationship with the new American electorate. And this project is a collaborative one with 2 of my good and dear collaborators, Lisa Garcia-Bedoya, who's at Berkeley, and Taylor Carlson, who was a graduate student of mine, but now is on the faculty at Washington University. So the motivation of this book is this notion, as the title suggests, that politics is inherently social. So we gain value, we learn about politics through our conversations with our friends, with our family, with our colleagues. And what's key here, and what we're really focusing on, is what's known as these informal conversations. So everyday conversations, everyday talk about politics, okay? Particularly with our social network of peers. So essentially, we generally have somewhere between 5 to 10 individuals that we discuss important matters with. So this is really the key motivation that guides these books, is how do these conversations with those individuals in our networks affect our political engagement. At the same time, the book focuses on this demographic reality about the changing nature of the US electorate. So Asian Americans are currently the fastest growing ethno-racial group in the United States. And then the census projects that by 2050, those of Latino origin are going to be 1 out of every 4 Americans. Okay, and so the other key piece to keep in mind is that there have been numerous scholars who studied the political behavior of the 3 largest ethnic and racial groups, Asian Americans, Blacks, and Latinos, and have found that their political behavior is distinctive when you compare it to white Americans. But what's rather surprising is that scholars actually know not that much about how these political discussion networks operate for ethnic and racial minorities. And if we consider the social positioning that minorities in the United States have, there's reason to believe that these political discussion networks may not operate in the same ways for them as they do for white Americans, okay? And then activist organizations, community organizations, and grassroots organizations have long recognized and emphasized the importance of the social nature of politics. And again, here specifically, we're focusing on the conversations that we have with our network of individuals. And these are the 4 organizations in California that we worked with to gain some insights on this relationship. So the basic research questions that we address in the book, but for today I'm just going to focus on 2 key ones, is number 1, what do political discussion networks look like across ethno-racial groups? And what I mean by that is, what do they look like? Who are in these networks? Meaning, do we talk to our family the most? Do we talk to friends? Do we talk to colleagues? What does the distribution look like by their partisan affiliations? Do we only talk to people who have the same party identification as we do, or is it a range of individuals? The other thing we look at is, how big are these networks, right? So some people have really large networks, others are smaller. And then how often do individuals talk to people in their networks, which is what we refer to as discussion frequency, okay? And then the other question that I will focus on today's talk is, how do these different characteristics, so these 3 characteristics that I just highlighted, how does that help to explain political engagement and participation for Asian Americans, Blacks, and Latinos? Okay. Now in the book, we explore a whole range of other key political attributes, including political knowledge, engagement, issue preferences, political trust, and political efficacy, and its relationship to network characteristics. But just for this talk, I'm going to focus on political engagement and non-electoral participation. So just to have a sense of where other scholars have come down on looking at this particular question, it's been a really well-researched question, in the sense that going back to 1954, one of the preeminent scholars who understood the importance of the social nature of politics, Barrelson and his colleagues, conducted this really in-depth study, which was based in Elmira, New York. Several decades later, Huckfeld and Sprague based a really novel and original data collection effort in South Bend, Indiana, to try to understand who we talk to and why that matters in our political engagement. Okay, and then subsequent other scholars in the early 2000s. But the one thing that ties all of these studies together, aside from the subject focus of political discussion networks, is the fact that most of their studies, or the overwhelming majority, focused exclusively on understanding political discussion networks amongst white Americans. Okay, a lot of this has to do with, obviously, where these studies were conducted, in Elmira, New York, South Bend, Indiana. And part of it too is a limitation in the kinds of data collection efforts that were possible during these different time periods. Right? But the general consensus is that these studies on political discussion networks and how they relate to political engagement is only really well established and well understood for white Americans. Okay. And so what this political discussion network literature found is that it can influence our political behavior through network size. So the general idea here is that the larger networks that you have, meaning the more people you talk to, that's correlated with having more information about politics, right? On the flip side, if you only have 1 or 2 people that you talk to about politics on a regular basis, you're less likely to have information about politics. The other piece of networks that can be influential is how partisan and how homogeneous is your network. Meaning, the more co-partisans that you have in your network, that's usually been found to be positively related to your political engagement. So if I self-identify as a Democrat, if 80% of the individuals who I talk to are also Democrats, that's generally been found to be positively related to your political engagement. Okay. The other aspect of networks that's been found to be influential in your political behavior is how often you talk about politics. So again, this is pretty intuitive, but if you talk to somebody in your discussion network every single day of the week, right, that is going to be more positively associated with you being more politically involved and politically engaged versus somebody who only talks to an individual in their network once a week or not even at all. Right? So the idea here is that you're gaining information from your networks, And that is positively related to your political behavior, especially when it comes to turnout, right? But what I emphasized before, though, is that we are really at this point rather unclear of whether or not this positive relationship also has the same effects for ethnic and racial minorities in the United States. So there have been two existing studies that have looked at this relationship, but don't really focus on political engagement. Instead, these two studies focus on issue attitudes. Right? So the big goal of this project of ours is to say, well, how does this theory and how does this understanding of networks, how does that map on to racial and ethnic minority groups in the United States? Okay. So we have strong reason to believe, just like much of the existing literature, that these political discussion networks are heavily influenced by the kinds of opportunities that one is embedded in, right? So that you're constrained by the social setting, and especially in the case for racial and ethnic minorities, where they're situated within this social context, and the kinds of opportunities that are attached to them affect their political attitudes and engagement. And so what I mean by that is simply that if you think about who you talk to, right, that's constrained, can be constrained by, for example, where you live. Right? And if we consider that in the United States, we have extremely high rates of residential racial segregation, that obviously constrains who you talk to on an everyday basis in your neighborhood, for example. Right? So this is an example of the kinds of what's referred to as the social context and the opportunity structures that exist for racial and ethnic minorities in the United States. Okay, and so of course these are shaped by your social position, and for both historical and political reasons in the United States, this is strongly affected by your ethnic and racial group membership. Okay, so based on the kinds of constrained opportunity structures and the social positionings that Asian Americans, Blacks, and Latinos have in the United States, we expect them to have smaller networks and discuss politics less frequently than for whites. There have been numerous studies that have shown that there is this participation gap that exists between racial and ethnic minorities, well, particularly for Asian Americans and Latinos relative to Blacks and whites. Okay, if you look at national trends, if you look at state trends, there's a participation gap at every level of, if you think about electoral politics, non-electoral politics, and even if you look at rates of registration. Okay, so roughly we're speaking like between, say, Asian Americans and whites and Latinos and whites, like almost 20% gap in turnout rates. Okay, so that is a well understood and defined reality that despite the increasing numbers in these two populations in the United States, their rates of political participation still lag behind those of whites and Blacks considerably. Okay? And so related to that, okay, part of that could also be correlated with the characteristics of their networks. Okay? We also expect that partisan networks, meaning what the composition of Latinos discussion networks look like, will be the most heterogeneous, meaning have the most partisan variability, whereas Blacks partisan networks will be the most homogeneous. Okay, and so there has been some work, including some of my own, that for many immigrant communities, what partisanship means is still very much something that is not well defined and still in transition. And so for this reason, many Latinos, many Asian Americans actually choose to identify as independents increasingly at higher rates, especially if you compare that to whites. In the case of Blacks, that's a very unique situation given their historical ties with the Democratic Party, that despite their socioeconomic variation within the community, there's still overwhelmingly a very strong allegiance to the Democratic Party. So if you go back to the 2016, and in particular, if you look back at the presidential elections in 2012 and 2008, Black support for the Democratic presidential candidate is somewhere within 90 to 95%. Right? And this is a trend that is consistent across time. Okay? And so this high degree of linked fate amongst Blacks, basically this understanding that They make many of their political decisions, not what's good based on for each individual, but what's best for the party, has largely explained their strong allegiance to the Democratic Party. Okay, and because, especially for Latinos, that this partisanship is still not a very well-defined and well-fixed attribute and social identity for them, we expect it to have less predictive power on their levels of political participation. Okay, relative to, if you think about, there's been a lot of research looking at how partisan your networks are amongst whites. There's a very strong and positive relationship there, right? So this idea that birds of a feather flock together, that's really been a strong and consistent finding in explaining political engagement for white Americans. Okay, and so our attempts to be able to answer these questions really necessitated the implementation of an original survey to be able to have information on racial and ethnic minorities in the United States, but more importantly, to also have information about who they talk about politics with, okay? Because when I was going through historically all of these founding works on this topic, right, one of the shortcomings of those studies is that the samples of ethnic and racial minorities were far too small to be able to do any sort of statistical analysis on. So to overcome those data limitations, what we did was we partnered with 4 community organizations in California to field an original survey where we specifically chose to oversample Latino, Black, and Asian voters. Now these community organizations, 2 of them were based in South Los Angeles, 1 was based, and 2 were based up in Northern California. They work primarily with communities of color, and so it was a great partnership with them because their organizations were primarily comprised of ethnic and racial minorities, and so that worked out well. So the organizations, what they did was they provided us with a list of their contacts. So every election year, each of these organizations has a list of hundreds of thousands of voters who they try to target and mobilize to turn out on election day. And then specifically what makes this survey pretty unique from your average public opinion or your political survey is it included what's known as a political discussion network name generator. And all that is really is that we ask every survey respondent to the following questions. So we ask them, what are the first and last names of the people who you talked with about important matters? Okay, and so notice here, we don't explicitly ask about politics, we just say important matters because research that is focused on this shows that in general, there's a really high correlation between important matters and politics. And so not as to prime the respondents, we just said important matters with, so they could think broadly. And then what we did was, then after they listed, so individuals were given the ability, survey respondents, to list up to 5 individuals that they talked about the important matters with, right? And then what we did after that is we sent the same exact survey to those people they listed to ask them to participate in the survey, okay? So by doing that, we were able to collect information on the survey respondent and then what we call their discussion partners. Okay, so this is how you are able to generate information and data about your social networks, right? But as you can imagine, and as I'll go through, these are not the easiest kinds of surveys to run, to implement. We also included a whole battery of other survey items about self-reported rates of political participation, their issue attitudes, how much knowledge they have about politics, their feelings on a wide range of political attitudes like political efficacy, trust, demographic variables, et cetera, okay? So this was an online survey that we distributed over email following the November 2016 election. We invited approximately 250,000 individuals to participate in the survey. We had a pretty low response rate, shockingly so, despite monetary incentives for completing the survey. So every individual that we emailed, they received a $5 Amazon gift card for participating in the survey. Despite that monetary incentive though, the response rates were still pretty low, okay? Lower than what we expected. Usually in these kinds of surveys, it's like 9 to 10% when you offer an incentive. And I think we learned a lot. Probably has to do a lot too with the population that we were targeting. Many of the community organizations, the ones we work with, gave us feedback that, you know, particularly for these communities, email might not be the most effective way to reach out to them. And for many of them, the only way that they really are successful at getting surveys and feedback from their communities is primarily through door-to-door canvassing. Okay. And so because of this fairly low response rate, we conducted an oversample in January 2017. And all that means is that we invited more individuals to participate in the survey, specifically on Latinos and Blacks. Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, we also invited all the named discussants, so everybody that they listed as people they talked about important matters with, to participate in the survey. They were also given $5 for having participated in the survey. And then one sort of nice feature about this survey data is that we were able to merge it with the California voter file because these are lists that community organizations use to canvass individuals for elections. It included a unique code that we could use to merge it with the voter file, which is publicly available. So here we were actually able to look at their validated turnout as opposed to self-reported turnout. And so all that means is that validated turnout is the official records from the registrar. So, you know, just as you might imagine, there is a tendency for individuals to over-report voting if it's self-reported versus when you compare it to the actual voter file records. So at least this gives us a bit of a more accurate measure of what turnout was. Okay, so the way that we tested the relationship between these discussion networks and political participation was we ran a series of statistical tests. Here, the primary variables that we were interested in explaining were these measures of political participation. And so we had two different forms of political participation. One was simply the number of non-electoral political activities that an individual participated in. So this ranged anywhere from signing a ballot, attending a political meeting, donating money, et cetera, every kind of political activity that does not pertain to voting in an election. Because that was our second measure of political participation, which is validated turnout, where we measured how often they voted in the last 5 elections. So that ranged from 0 to 5. Okay. Now the primary variables of interest that we think help to explain political participation are these network characteristics, the 3 ones that I discussed earlier. So the first one was network size. And again, individuals could have said that they talked to 0 people or a maximum of 5. And we capped it at 5 because the existing research suggests that if you're thinking about their sort of closest networks, in general, people don't go beyond having 5 individuals. Partisan composition, so we also asked every respondent to give us their best guess as to what party ID each of their discussion partners was. Right? And then finally, we asked them to self-report how often they talk to each individual. And that scale ranged from they talk to them never, or that they talk to them a great deal. Okay. The statistical models also control for other variables that could potentially explain political engagement as well. So demographic characteristics, levels of political knowledge, so all these kinds of other standard predictors of political participation that's usually accounted for in the existing research. So just to give you a sense of what the survey actually looked like, our survey respondents, you can see that interestingly enough, Asian Americans were the most responsive to our surveys. They made up almost 50, just under 50%, or just about 50% of our respondent sample. Like I mentioned before, because we had to do an oversample of Blacks and Latinos, so Latinos are just slightly above 20% and Blacks a little bit below that. If you look at the breakdown here between their nativity, so were they born in the United States or were they born abroad, the overwhelming majority of our respondents were born in the United States. And then here is just one other demographic attribute, which is gender. We had a far larger percentage of females who took the survey relative to males. Okay. Now, this is also, I think, an important piece of information to get a sense of. So this simply presents the number of respondents who listed discussants in their networks. Okay, so as we would expect, and as the existing research has also done, is that most people can name at least one person they talk to about important matters with. So this is the named 3,276 individuals gave us at least one name, right? However, as we ask them for their second, third, fourth, and fifth discussion partner, those numbers start to drop, right? So people can easily think of one person they talked about politics with, two people, but as we start asking and probing them to have 3, 4, and 5, that number starts to decrease, okay? Which is, I think, also an interesting and telling sort of observation about when you're asked to kind of, at the moment, to think of who you talk about important matters with, it's generally not a lot of individuals. Okay? The other characteristic that we asked about was, well, what is your relationship with these people in your networks? Okay, and the options that they were provided is it could either be a family member. So we broke this down to between like a family member, a relative, or a spouse. Here we just aggregate anybody who's a family member. A close friend is in the orange bars, co-workers here in the gray, and acquaintances in the yellow. Okay, so pretty much consistent with the existing research, with the exception of Asian Americans. Most of us name, most people's close networks ties are with your family members, followed by your close friends. Okay. What an interesting difference, though, that comes up here when we look at these relationships broken down by race and ethnicity, though, is that Asians have more close friends in their networks than Blacks. Okay, so that is that's denoted here by the orange bars that show that if you compare Asians, the percent who have close friends in their networks relative to Latinos and whites, those differences are statistically significant from one another. Okay, and so again, this finding is pretty consistent with existing literature that most of the people in our discussion networks are made up of these close ties, which is family and close friends, as opposed to these weaker ties, which would be defined as a coworker or an acquaintance, okay, which again makes a lot of sense. Now, this is something that we had hypothesized, that we would expect to see differences in the size of the networks according to your racial and ethnic identity. And so here we do find support for that, right? You can see that that whites were the group that were able to name much more likely to name 5 discussion partners in their network relative to Asians, Blacks, and Latinos. Okay, and then if you look on the other spectrum of that, Latinos were the most had the highest percentage of reporting no discussion partners compared to whites, where that share and that percentage is much smaller. Okay, so again, why we're seeing these differences, we argued, was thinking about the kinds of the opportunity structures and the social constraints that are afforded across these different racial and ethnic groups, which is obviously correlated as well to the kinds of networks that they can build. Okay? Now here, this is the network characteristics about how often do you talk about important matters with your discussion partners. And once again, we find a similar pattern where minorities discuss politics less often with their networks relative to whites, okay? And so all these little bars, the only thing that this suggests is that these are, is able to discern whether these differences are actually statistically significantly different from one another, and it's telling us that they are, okay? If you're comparing it across ethnic and racial groups, when you're looking at it by nativity, so US born versus foreign born, there's no significant difference there. Okay. Now here is a breakdown of what the partisanship in the discussion networks look like. Okay. So Republicans, the share of Republicans in their network is denoted by these red bars, Democrats blue, independents purple, don't know and refuse are gray and white. Okay. And so given our sample, which we acknowledge is not a nationally representative one, it does definitely skew primarily Democratic, okay? But what's interesting too is that if you look at Latinos, okay, there is a statistically significant difference between their knowledge of the partisanship of those in their networks compared to the other groups. Compared to whites and Asians specifically. So that is, if you look at this gray bar here, this percentage of don't know is, you can see, is significantly larger than it is for whites. Which kind of suggests that, maybe partisanship for Latinos, again, this is what the existing research is indicating, is just less of a meaningful indicator for them when you're thinking about politics, especially in the social context. Okay. And here, this just looks at the rates of co-partisanship. So that all that just means is how many individuals. So again, to the analogy I put earlier, if I self-identify as a Democrat, what is the percentage of co-partisans in my network, other Democrats, right? So here on this right-hand side of the graph, those are the distributions, but here you can see that blacks had the largest percentage of co-partisans in their networks, followed by Latinos, Asians, and whites. Okay. So once again, this is consistent with our expectations. Right. Now here we're moving away from the discussion network characteristics to look at our dependent variables of interest, which were political engagement. Okay. And so as I was discussing before, even if you look at our survey, where we asked those non-electoral participation questions, you see significant differences in their self-reported number of civic engagement activities that they engage in along the lines of race and ethnicity. Okay? Particularly when you compare white and black civic engagement compared to Asians and blacks. Right? It's almost one, they participate at like one activity less than do whites and blacks. Okay. Again, this looks at turnout, right? So once again, along the lines of race and ethnicity, you do see variations in turnout, where was the number of the last 5 elections that were voted in amongst blacks and whites were significantly more than it was for Latinos, especially. Okay, notice that both in this analysis and in the previous one, we really don't find any major differences or significant differences between U.S. and foreign-born individuals. Okay. So all the sort of existing research that we've seen and the statistics about electoral participation gap, as well as civic engagement gap, that is something that we found in this survey as well. Okay. So here is just a statistical model where we control for the network characteristics as well as all those other demographics. And all this says, with all these little stars, is that this variable of how often they talk about politics and how big the networks are is what has the highest amount of predictive power in explaining political engagement. And so what that means is that the larger your networks are, so those individuals who said they had 5 discussion partners, that means that you're more likely to engage in these political activities, okay, relative to those who have smaller network sizes. And then likewise for discussion frequency, which is the second variable, simply means that the more often you talk about politics with your discussion partners, then that's also positively related to your levels of political engagement. Now, interestingly, this final characteristic of networks that we look at, which is the percentage of co-partisans, it really doesn't have as much predictive power, or it's not as consistently strong compared to these other 2 network characteristics. So among Latinos and Blacks in particular, how many co-partisans you have in your network doesn't have a statistically significant impact in your levels of political engagement. Okay. Now, when we look at turnout, we see a similar relationship where network size, so larger networks talking about politics more in your social networks, those are all positive and important predictors of explaining whether or not you're going to vote. But again, how many co-partisans you have in your network, that has very or no little predictive power in this particular model. Okay. So we also, given sort of the unique nature of how we conducted our survey, we also analyzed other surveys that had these name generators just to make sure that our findings were not extremely anomalous. Okay, so we looked at these 3 different surveys, this multi-city study of urban inequality, the 2004 General Social Survey, and the 2008 and 2009 American National Election Studies. And in general, we found similar patterns from our survey with these other surveys, which kind of gave us confidence that our findings were not atypical, right? So in these first 3 surveys, most network discussants are relatives. In the National American Studies, we found that the percentage of co-partisans in the networks was highest among Blacks. And then in 2 of these surveys, we also found the same pattern that we saw, that whites have the largest networks compared to other racial ethnic groups. Okay. And then here, I didn't present this data because it was pretty limited since we didn't have the adequate amount of information. But another aspect that you can think about of networks and this idea about being homophilous is that racial and ethnic minorities typically will tend to have a high number of other co-ethnics or co-racials in their networks. And we found a similar pattern in these other surveys as well. Now, one thing that has always been a challenge in this particular area of research is to try to figure out, well, is it the case that we choose who we talk to, or is the relationship the other way around? Right? Because the way that I presented this project so far is that we actually have a choice in who we choose to talk to about politics. But it could very well be the case that because of, language barriers or other constraints, that we may be just forced to, we have very little options in who we're talking about with our networks. Okay, so that is something that that has plagued social scientists who have been interested in studying discussion networks. And that's just one of the things to keep in mind about the kinds of challenges that these sorts of studies face. Okay. Now, what we wanted to do to complement the surveys, the survey analysis in this project was also to gain some qualitative insights amongst individuals who actually are tasked with talking to individuals on an everyday basis about politics. So what we did was we conducted 13 in-depth interviews with canvassers, so essentially canvassers from the 4 organizations that we partnered with, who work on mobilization campaigns or whatever strategies or whatever campaigns these organizations have from a variety of different backgrounds. Okay. So altogether, we were able to get a fairly even number from APEN, which is primarily an Asian American organization, 4 from Community Coalition, and 4 from Scope. Now, both of these organizations are from South Los Angeles, so primarily serving a Black and Latino population. Okay. Now, we thought that our decision to interview canvassers would be ideal since they are the ones responsible for talking to individuals and eligible voters in everyday political conversations. So again, what's really key here is to think about informal conversations, right? And if you've ever done any canvassing work, you know that you're sent out with a script, but oftentimes that script changes depending on the kind of conversation that you're having. Okay, so this is one quote that I particularly like because he talks about being a political science major, which I was. So he says, I have friends that go to college and take political science as a major, and I'm actually able to learn from them as they learn from me because they're learning from textbooks. I'm learning from firsthand experience, I'd rather speak to someone who actually is in my situation, in my shoes, than someone who just is going off of what they read from a book, because it's two completely different things. I mean, I'm not knocking it because it does give you helps you grasp things a little better, but still, that has nothing to do with firsthand accounts. And so this was from one of our male Latino canvassers, who's actually a formerly incarcerated individual as well. And what this quote highlights, right, is that having this interactive experience, having these conversations is where learning occurs, especially about politics. Right? So I think what's nice here too that he's highlighting is that there's a real difference between talking, having conversations about politics versus having something that you learn from books. Okay? Another canvasser says things are happening, change is happening, we're overcoming the stigma of politics, okay? Which has long been a struggle with these marginalized communities of overcoming the stigma that being part of politics is not something that they should be engaged in. Okay. Here, another canvasser, this time from Community Coalition, what she says is that I'm part of this community, and I believe that by me knowing people, I could tell 5 other people, and those same people could make our community aware of what's going on. Right? And she goes on to talk about why they don't vote, but this is precisely what the idea of social networks is, right? That if you talk to individuals, that can have these kinds of network effects that then those individuals will go on and tell friends within their networks, right? And then this final canvasser says, I definitely think people should talk about politics. Politics are literally, to me, the forces and conditions that are shaping our lives, and so it doesn't make any sense to me not to talk about that. Okay, so again, what that canvasser is reiterating is that talking about politics, and again, not these kinds of formal presentations, but just these informal conversations that we have on a daily basis are important, and they're not inconsequential to our political behavior, right? But what we're really hoping to contribute with this research is that to keep in mind that the scope and frequency of who we talk to varies along the lines of race and ethnicity. And although we don't focus on it in this project, a lot of the kind of feedback that we've gotten is, well, what does that conversation look like? Because you can imagine that those kinds of conversations are going to be different along different racial and ethnic groups as well. Okay. One of the kind of major things that we found here is that we do see differences in network characteristics, right? Smaller network sizes talk about politics less frequently, and that in general, and comparatively speaking, these networks have less predictive power on Black political participation. The other thing to keep in mind, I didn't show them here today, but I can just say that how impactful these different network characteristics are also vary by race and ethnicity. And that just means how important or how predictive they are on your political participation. Okay? And again, in general, co-partisanship doesn't have a lot of explanatory power in Asian and white political engagement. And Latinos were the least certain of partisanship of their political process. So what we think are some of the interesting implications from our project is that it's key to think about social context and positionings of Asian Americans, Blacks, and Latinos to help us understand what aspects of their political discussion networks predict their political behavior. And we also hope to fill a gap, but also to, really push to have future research continue to look at social context as an important driver of political behavior. Because up until recently, much of the existing research has really focused on individual level attributes, meaning what is your level of education? How much income do you have? That those are the primary factors that drive who participates in politics and who doesn't. Right? So our hope is that it paves the way for future scholars to incorporate these kinds of contextual level characteristics, especially into studies of minority political engagement. Okay, so I will end there. Thank you very much.
So we have time for questions. Yes.
So one of the maybe implications or usefulness of this is if you want to believe that Latino, Asian, and Black communities might see more turnout, more political engagement, then you might want to influence some of the factors that lead to that, going backwards in your talk, to increase the size of networks or increase the activity of the networks. Right? That's the logic going back. And then what we lost me was at the very beginning, where you said that the size of one's network is influenced by segregation and it certainly shows in your data that it does differ from white size. The network size for those three groups is smaller than, but I don't see the logic. Why is segregation going to limit the number of people one discusses politics with? Indeed, you might expect in some of those communities, the church is a very powerful place to have engagement. It isn't just this segregation doesn't strike me as doing the work unless you then make a jump and say the social conditions that people live in doesn't give them the space to talk about politics because they're working more, they're engaged more in just surviving, and so politics becomes a luxury. But segregation doesn't seem to do it. I love that's the question.
Yeah, so I didn't mean to imply that it was segregation that was doing the work. So this is, but it's part of what this theory is grounded in is this social positioning, right? And so the kind of constraints that happen with that social positioning and for all the things you mentioned, residential rates of racial segregation is also correlated with socioeconomic status, right? All these other socioeconomic indicators, which, as we know, also goes hand in hand with your feelings of political efficacy, right? Your feeling of political agency, especially. Right? So if you live in these marginalized communities, right, where oftentimes you feel that your role in politics is either not welcomed or that it's not having much of an impact, right? That can also, and also if you live amongst co-racials or co-ethnics who similarly likewise feel the same way because of history of discrimination and marginalization, then that can lead to, say, to less robust and rich networks, right? Which is essentially, we're proxying that by measures of network size and discussion frequency. How rich is your network? Because that's really what the social network literature is saying, is that the more robust, the more informationally rich your network is, that's what's helping to drive your degree of, your extent of political engagement.
But is size the right figure?
So,
that doesn't strike me.
So it is an imperfect measure, right? I don't think that perfectly maps onto how you can exactly measure the robustness of your network. But again, this is, in general, this has been one of the characteristics that social network and analysts have used just as a rough proxy for that. With the expectation that size is also correlated with information. Right? So more people you have, you're getting more information because you're getting it from a more diverse group of individuals, as opposed to just having one person in your network.
In the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that you had a very low rate of response to these surveys. And I couldn't help but think that, is it possible that one of the reasons might be that you are asking people to list their first and last name of the people they're closest to and who they discuss important matters with? I mean, I wouldn't do that, and I would think that if I was a member of a vulnerable minority population, I wouldn't do that.
Yes, and I think that there's something to that. Certainly one, I mean, it's still pretty much what you would think as a cold invitation, but these are individuals we contacted through the organization, and we did say that in the invitation that we received your name. So not to kind of be as intimidating, through a community organization that you've worked with, okay? But your point is well taken, and in fact, I don't have the exact number, but many respondents just listed the first name of the person. Wouldn't even list their entire name, right? And really for us, it's not even, we're not really even interested, we have no interest whatsoever in the names. What was really key was to be able to get their email address so we could actually email them and ask them to take the survey, which was difficult, as you can imagine, in and of itself, because individuals were reluctant to share that information as well, which is one of the difficulties of doing this kind of project when you're looking at networks, is to get that information because of precisely the reasons you bring up.
Thank you very much. It's a very big pleasure opportunity.
Thank you. Actually, comment on the two issues. First issue about definition of network. Okay, the second network. As your research seems to overlook currently the online community, and many people interact, say, politically exchange political opinions through online community where they don't know actually the real names.
Yeah.
Most people, some people know, and some people don't know. But actually, they are strongly influenced by the discussions.
Yeah.
That's one issue. So I have one example. Say during the 2016 election, presidential election, actually the last time for the decisive battle is, I think the one is Pennsylvania, another Michigan. Okay, only about 60,000 voter differences. That's actually turned to Trump. Okay, who made these 60,000 differences? I understand actually the Asian Americans. Actually, most of them actually on the East Coast, they vote for Trump. That's created this kind of make the whole, electoral college differences. Okay, make because these two states, of course, they have a lot of votes. So just then go back to the second issue, what is the Asian American? Asian American is probably, I cannot comment on the Latino community. Okay. But the Asian American is very complicated. It's say Chinese never talk to Japanese unless they are, not on the surface. Korean don't talk to Chinese, and Filipino, Indians, Chinese and Indian, they do not talk to each other. Pakistan, they don't talk to Indians. So there is such a complex, okay. When you even put people in one group, but actually they are not. They do not use the same language, they don't have a cultural tradition. Many people, of course, they are cultural. They Americanized, so they may interact on a daily basis, but they don't actually share many things in the community because they each have different communities. Even in Chinese community, the Taiwanese and Cantonese don't. The Hong Kong, they don't talk to mainland. Okay, you see that's how complicated it is. So when you just put everybody in one category, then say they all have shared whatever similar trends, so that may misleading.
Yeah, so thank you for your comments. On the first point, so the way that we worded the question, it was pretty vague. So I see your point, because online communities, certainly this is we didn't specify who are the people you discuss important matters with face to face. So certainly there is a possibility that somebody could have listed someone that they only interact with online, or someone they only talk to over the phone. This has been a comment that we've received before. I would say though that and we ask for their contact information. So maybe you don't have that information when you're just kind of on these sort of more impersonal online spaces. But there has been some recent research that looks at the importance of these online communities, especially for like activism and these social movements. So that is definitely an important source of political engagement. And to your second point, certainly, someone who studies race and politics, I very much sympathize that yes, these pan-ethnic labels of Asian Americans, Blacks, Latinos, they are problematic because they ignore the differences. At least for our sample here, because we're working with this Asian Pacific Environmental Network group in Northern California, its overwhelming majority here are Chinese Americans. So I would say 80% of the Asian Americans in our survey are of Chinese origin. So at least in this survey, and then for Latinos, overwhelmingly Mexican Americans too.
Yeah.
Throughout a great deal of your presentation, you talked about a lot of the different categories of responses or interactions between coworkers. And I wondered if your study included the impact of white supremacy and the fear that, for example, maybe white people are really comfortable talking about their political views at work because they're not as afraid of getting fired. I'm a student in this school, and I may be a white-looking person, but I'm terrified to talk about my political beliefs on my college campus, which is like the one place to do that. So I wondered if your studies and the questions and the online interactions provided a sense of correlation between the lack of response and the post-2016 hate crimes rising and the retributions against people of color of any kind.
Yeah, so I wish. The short answer is no. This particular survey was kind of really challenging to do in and of itself, but certainly I think that is very much an important step going forward, is to actually look at what the content of these conversations look like.
Because that's the hugest reason for why my group of marginalized friends do not want to participate in politics, whether it's because they are trans or people of color, is the straight up fear of violence. And I think that missing from these types of surveys ultimately prevents the data from being fully accurate.
Yeah, I think it's just, I think social scientists who study this topic, it's very difficult to get that kind of, like you said, right, especially you're talking about the vulnerable populations and then the tendency for social desirability and the kinds of responses to give, how you can actually get that. But I think probably would be better suited on a more qualitative approach to actually sit with individuals and interview them and talk to them about those kinds of feelings. That's a great suggestion. Thank you.
Hi, I'm wondering what was something that you gleaned from this survey or this research that helped you better understand or give a different lens to your previous research and previous kind of body of work?
Oh, that's a great question. I never really thought about it. I think, one of the biggest challenges of this project was that because of the comparative nature that we were looking across racial and ethnic groups, we also, in the book, we also looked at gender differences, we also looked at differences by nativity, is having all those different comparisons and those moving pieces really was a challenge compared to being able to, in some of my previous work, in the last book on white backlash, that just focused primarily on white Americans, right? So the advantage you get from these kinds of comparisons is you can leverage a lot more insights across the different groups, but at the same time, it's a lot more challenging to be able to discuss them systematically and also without in such a way that's just too overwhelming for a reader.
Yes. First of all, I agree with the lady with brown hat here. I would not have done your survey giving first and last name because I would not want to set up my friends and family for getting hassled. Secondly, big picture, what do you see would help people actually vote for this country? Because to me, it's pathetic. I mean, there are countries where standing in line votes, you get shot at, and the turnout rates are much better than ours. So what can get Americans to actually vote more?
Just answer it.
I'm so sorry, I missed the last part of your statement. What was your question?
This is a little bit off topic, but you know, in this country, we get more than 50% turnout. It's considered a pretty good turnout. There are countries where we get shot at for standing in line and voting, and that turnout's close to 80%. What can we do, do you think, to get Americans to vote in greater numbers as a higher percentage? It is our civic duty. We're not just civic stuff. It's still a lot of that.
Well, I can tell you, maybe this is a cop-out, but I can tell you that it's not about just having these electoral changes. So say having same-day voter registration, right? Having ballots sent home to everybody. Even, we don't have this, but you know, there have been many proposals to make election day a holiday. So all of those kinds of institutional, what we like to think of as these institutional reforms, we haven't really seen meaningful jumps in turnout if we just make these simple fixes, right? Like overcome these barriers, make it easier for people to register, vote. They can vote on the same day, they can turn their ballot in a week before. This is what we're doing in California with these voting centers now starting this year. Thus far, we don't have a lot of evidence that that moves turnout out, right? So my sense of it is, and this is where more recent research is looking, is it really has to do with changing the cognitive mindset of voters, right? So it's more of a psychological shift of how do you get, especially for the group of voters that I particularly focus on, for racial and ethnic minorities and other marginalized groups, is how do you get these folks to think of themselves as voters? Right? There are so many Latinos that there's actually a campaign they're called the Great Unengaged. So they've been eligible, they've been registered to vote for, you know, the last 20 years. They have just never voted, right? So it's not constraints of citizenship, of registration. It's just, there's no incentive to vote, I think, for many individuals, and this is to your point as well, unless you can make them feel like they are part of the political process and that their sense of political agency is meaningful, right? Because again, we've seen lots of evidence where states enact these kinds of changes that lower the barriers to voting. But that's really been a lot of the research to say, we just need to lower the barriers, right? Make election day mandatory, which is what they do in other countries. And we haven't moved there, but all these other little changes that different states have done, we haven't seen turnout jump to 80%. Right? So we know that's not the solution. So I hope that was helpful, but
Can I answer? I don't know.
Actually, there's a lot of folks who want to jump in, so we'll circle back to you. So, yes.
I was wondering, so I found that fascinating. If you can help me understand a little better sort of the conclusions or some of the takeaways of the points. As I'm thinking about it, I've got some sort of simplistic understandings of it, and I may be off. So part of what I'm hearing you say is that there's this positive correlation between the size of your network of discussants, the frequency with which you discuss politics, and then your engagement in politics. And so I reverse that sentence and said, well, those who are more engaged in politics talk about politics more and talk to more people. I'm like, yeah, I respect that. And I'm thinking, well, if you told me about sports and said people who participate more in sports talk with more people about sports, to me that seems like a fair, I believe you, but what do we do with that? Or, so anyhow, so that's where I'm at, and if you can help me understand the significance.
yeah, so that's what I was trying to, but I think it was lost, but that is what you just said is the primary issue that is challenging to this research, right? This causality, that is it driven by, you're already interested in yourself, so of course you're going to find people that are interested in politics as well, or is the relationship vice versa, right? I think that's what you're trying to say, isn't it? That you can go in both directions.
Sure.
Right. So what I was trying to convince you of is that it's talking to your networks. That's what leads to political engagement, right? That it's the networks, the talking to people, is what drives you to participate more in politics, not the other way around. Okay. I mean, again, you would have to design the study in a different way to be able to get at that endogeneity problem. But one thing to keep in mind in this study, but in other studies too, is that most people list their family, right? The majority is people they talk to. And so those are necessarily people you choose. I mean, you could, but for the most part, right, like your spouse, so you're not choosing to be in that network. Does that kind of help a little bit? Mm-hmm. So I think if they were if the overwhelming majority of those neural networks are like close friends or coworkers, I think then you could make that argument that, well, you are self-selecting and finding people who are more like you, right? But since we're finding that most people in their networks that they talk to about important matters are their family members, then that kind of argument is a little bit less persuasive. I think the key takeaway point here is that talking about politics, right, is just as important in explaining political engagement as is other individual level attributes that we, for so long in political science, have favored as the primary driver of who participates in politics and who does not. And what I mean by that is for so long, we've really emphasized that higher levels of more educated individuals, older individuals, those with higher socioeconomic status, those are the people who are the ones most likely to turn out in politics, okay? And what this study is really saying is, yeah, but even when we look with control for all those other variables, talking about politics with people in your network, that's just as important, right? Which is important especially for groups that have lower, like for minorities who are more politically underrepresented and less participatory, because then, fixing socioeconomic status doesn't happen overnight. But trying to enrich networks, make them more informationally robust, those are things that organizations and community activists can work on. Right? So I think that's one of the key takeaway points from the study.
Professor Stephen, and then you'll be next, right? Yeah.
I was just thinking about our definition of political engagement and watching and learning from a couple of Oregon Latino-based organizations that I've worked with who have strategies of engaging people very locally in school board campaigns, in city politics, police reform, etc., and sort of thinking about that as a kind of a long game, right? Right. Of getting people involved and then bringing in other kinds of politics. And I haven't done a statistical study, but according to those organizations, that's a successful strategy for engaging people. I wondered about the strategies of the organizations that you work with, and what kinds of exchanges you had with them about this question of kind of a long game.
Yeah, so it's actually virtually identical, right? So it's, and that was our hope with these interviews from the canvassers, to really try to flesh that out, that it's about talking about bringing it to their neighborhood level, bringing it to a level that not something abstract at the national level, but something that's meaningful and that affects them in their neighborhood. And once you start there, then politics doesn't feel as intimidating, as overwhelming, and as abstract and as impersonal as what national level politics looks like. But see, that's where the conversation matters, right? And so this is where having canvassers who are from your neighborhood, from your community, who can relate to you, who can talk to you about, hey, we have this local ballot initiative coming up. This is why you need to vote on this important bond for more public education, right? Because they can relate to them and they can understand them. So this is why, and this was part of this project, was that, which was generously funded by the James Irvine Foundation, was they wanted to look at these strategies called relational organizing, which maps on very closely to these kinds of social networks, because you have to build relationships with people in your community, and that's how you can start building the trust and the efficacy and the agency that leads to political participation.
Okay. Yes.
One of the things that struck me is the question of age. Maybe it's the next study, but do you have any idea about how homogeneous these responses you got in terms of age were? That may affect what you were measuring. And also the question of whether or not there's a change taking place in any of these groups based upon how long they live in the United States or how old they are, or some other kind of questions around the age issue.
Yes, so we have a measure just of your age, and then we also, to your point, we also looked at, so not exactly time in the United States, but whether or not they were born in the United States or whether they were born abroad. And that doesn't seem to explain, we don't see as much differences. And on the age, I mean, age is generally always positively correlated with political engagement. And had we had a larger sample size, I think we could have done analysis on that. But I'd have to go back and check and see what that distribution actually looks like.
Could it be stories, the groups, so in terms of actual ages, as opposed to younger or older people?
Yeah, so that is, we do take that factor into consideration in the statistical models of age.
So please join me in thanking Professor Abrajano. I know a few of you, Mia and others, wanted to have follow-up questions, and I'm sure she's going to stick around and chat with you about them. So, and see you at the next one, which is there's the resilience one tomorrow. So you'll see information about that in back, and if you want to be on our mailing list, you'll see a sign-up sheet in the back of the room. Have a good evening.
So good.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Why? Because I didn't let you ask right away. Yeah. Thanks for your questions.
I was just wondering, with social studies like this, if there were components to it that were because of lack of education.
Oh,
Good.
yeah, definitely.
Because, well, and not just in terms of library, but it's too much, and I still have to bring up because in those families to discuss whether
Is that your